You can be in a loving relationship and still feel deeply alone. Not because your partner is doing something wrong, but because there's a part of you that no one is really meeting. If you're sensitive, reflective, and you often feel lonelier inside your relationship than outside of it, this video is for you. You might be listening to this while thinking that your relationship is actually good, that there is love, loyalty, shared routines, moments of closeness, and a sense of stability. And that is exactly what makes this feeling so difficult to understand, because on the surface, nothing seems wrong. And yet, there is this quiet sense of being alone, not dramatically abandoned, not rejected, but alone with what truly lives inside you. For many sensitive people, loneliness does not come from a lack of love, but from a lack of emotional companionship, from the feeling that your inner world is something you are carrying by yourself. You may notice that you are the one who reflects more, who feels more, who notices subtle shifts in mood, tone, and emotional distance long before anything is spoken. And because you do not want to make things heavy or complicated, you often stay quiet. You tell yourself it is not that important, that this is just how relationships are, that you should be grateful, but the feeling does not go away. It shows up in small moments when you want to talk about something that moved you and the conversation stays practical, when you share something vulnerable and it is met with advice instead of presence, when you long to be understood but feel like you are explaining yourself instead. And none of this feels big enough to point at, which is exactly why it hurts so much, because how do you explain a loneliness that has no clear cause? You do not feel unloved. You feel unseen, not rejected, but emotionally alone next to someone. For sensitive people, connection is not just about spending time together. It is about feeling emotionally accompanied, about sensing that someone is with you in your inner experience, not fixing it, not reassuring it away, but staying present with it. When that presence is missing, loneliness quietly settles in, often unnoticed by the outside world, and sometimes even unnoticed by your partner, because you are still functioning, still kind, still there, while inside you are holding more than you are sharing. What makes this kind of loneliness even harder is that you often do not feel entitled to it, because when you look at your relationship from the outside, you can see that your partner is kind, present in their own way, and genuinely trying. And that makes you question your own experience rather than the situation itself. You might tell yourself that you are expecting too much, that you are too sensitive, too focused on emotions, or that this is simply what long-term relationships look like once the intensity settles. And because you are reflective, you tend to turn inward instead of outward, trying to understand the feeling rather than express it. Many sensitive people have a strong tendency to process things internally, to think them through carefully, to analyze where a feeling comes from before giving it space. And while that can be a strength, in this case it often leads to carrying everything alone. The more you try to solve this loneliness by yourself, the more isolated you begin to feel, because the very thing you are missing is not insight, but emotional presence. Over time, you may start to get used to holding your inner world quietly, not because you want to hide, but because past attempts to share did not lead to feeling met in the way you needed. So you adapt. You talk about daily life, practical matters, plans, routines, and things that are easy to share, while the deeper layers of what moves you, worries you, or touches something vulnerable inside you remain unspoken. Slowly, a distance begins to form, not necessarily between you and your partner as people, but between who you are on the inside and the version of yourself that shows up in the relationship. This distance is subtle, and because it develops gradually, it can go unnoticed for a long time. You may start to realize that you feel more understood in moments of solitude through music, books, or quiet reflection than you do in conversation with the person you love. And that realization can be painful because it raises a question you may not want to face yet. How is it possible to feel more yourself when you are alone than when you are together? For sensitive people, connection is not about constant talking or emotional intensity. It is about depth when it matters, about knowing that when something is important to you, it can be received and held, rather than quickly moved past. When that does not happen, loneliness does not arrive suddenly. It builds slowly, showing itself as emotional fatigue, a quiet pulling back, or a sense that you are editing yourself more than you would like. You may notice that you choose your words carefully, soften what you feel, or leave parts out, not because you are being dishonest, but because you want to protect yourself from the disappointment of not being met again. And this is where many sensitive people find themselves stuck, not unhappy enough to leave, but not fulfilled enough to truly relax. Living in an in-between space where love is present, yet emotional connection feels incomplete. There is often no clear problem to solve and no obvious conflict to point to, just a quiet ache that keeps returning, a sense that something subtle but essential is missing, even if you cannot fully name what that is. And because you cannot name it clearly, you may keep hoping it will resolve on its own, that you will adapt, or that the feeling will eventually fade, without realizing that this kind of loneliness is not something that disappears through waiting. For many sensitive people, this pattern did not suddenly appear in their current relationship, but has been quietly shaping the way they connect for a long time, often without them being fully aware of it. You may have learned early in life that staying connected meant being attentive, understanding, and emotionally available, sometimes even before you fully understood what you yourself were feeling. You might have been the one who sensed tension in the room, who noticed when something was off without anyone saying it out loud, who adapted your behavior, your tone, or your needs to keep things calm and relationally safe. Because that sensitivity helped things run more smoothly, it often went unnoticed, and sometimes it was even valued. But rarely was there space for your own inner world to be held with the same care. So you learned to do it yourself. You learned to carry emotions quietly, to process things internally, to not ask for too much, and to not make your needs too visible. Over time, this became so familiar that it felt normal, even though something essential was missing. When this pattern carries into adult relationships, it can create a dynamic where you are very good at understanding others, but much less practiced at being understood yourself. You may find yourself automatically taking responsibility for the emotional atmosphere, smoothing things over, or adjusting your expectations in order to maintain harmony. And because you are capable of doing this, no one immediately notices that you are carrying more than your share. This is how emotional loneliness can exist even in relationships that are loving and stable. Not because there is no care, but because emotional presence is unevenly distributed. You may be the one who listens more deeply, reflects more openly, and senses what is happening beneath the surface, while your own inner experiences remain largely unseen. Over time, this imbalance does not necessarily lead to conflict, but it does lead to fatigue. You might notice that you rarely feel emotionally surprised or deeply moved within the relationship, not because you no longer care, but because you have learned to stay within a range that feels manageable for the other person. The connection remains safe, but it no longer feels fully alive. And because you value depth, this safety without resonance slowly begins to feel empty. Your body often responds to this long before your mind does. You may feel a subtle heaviness in your chest, a sense of tension that does not have a clear cause, or an emotional tiredness that does not go away with rest. These are not signs that something is wrong with you, but signals that a part of you has been carrying itself alone for too long. Many sensitive people respond to this by withdrawing in small, almost invisible ways. You may stop bringing up certain thoughts, stop sharing parts of your inner world, or turn more towards solitude as a place where you feel less edited and more real. On the outside, the relationship continues as usual, but on the inside, something begins to close. This is not a conscious decision. It is a form of adaptation. And adaptation, when it becomes a way of living, slowly turns into emotional distance, not because love has disappeared, but because presence has. What this kind of loneliness is often trying to tell you is not that your relationship is wrong, and not that you need to make a decision immediately, but that something inside you wants to be acknowledged instead of managed. For a long time, you may have treated this feeling as something you should understand, regulate, or work through on your own, because that is what you are good at. But loneliness like this does not disappear through insight alone. It does not soften because you have explained it to yourself well enough. It softens when it is allowed to exist without being pushed aside or minimized. Many sensitive people have a deep reflex to move away from discomfort, not by distraction, but by self-reflection. You try to make sense of what you feel so thoroughly that you no longer have to stay with the raw experience of it. But this loneliness asks for something different. It asks you to slow down and notice that a part of you wants emotional presence. Not later, not someday, not theoretically, but in the everyday reality of your connection. Admitting that to yourself can be unsettling, because once you do, you can no longer rely on the idea that everything is fine simply because it looks fine. You may begin to notice how often you soften your truth before speaking, how often you say it's okay when it actually is not, and how often you choose harmony over honesty, not because you are afraid of your partner, but because you are afraid of not being met. This is where loneliness turns into information. It begins to show you the places where you are still adapting at the cost of your own presence, where you are maintaining connection by quietly leaving yourself out of it. And again, this does not mean those adaptations were wrong. They may have been necessary for a long time. But what once helped you stay connected may now be limiting the depth of connection you are capable of. Sensitive people often reach a point where their inner life becomes too rich, too alive, and too honest to remain hidden without consequence. When that happens, loneliness intensifies, not to punish you, but to guide you. It highlights the gap between who you are becoming and how you are currently relating, and it invites you to become more truthful with yourself before you become more expressive with anyone else. You may start to feel a quiet tension inside, a sense that you are holding back words, feelings, or longings that want to be shared but do not yet know how. And the longer you hold them back, the heavier they become. At some point you may realize that this loneliness is not only about the other person, but also about your relationship with yourself, about how often you silence what you feel in order to keep things stable and predictable. This is not a call to confront or demand, and it is not an instruction to leave. It is an invitation to listen more closely to what your inner world is asking of you. Sometimes that leads to slower, more vulnerable conversations. Sometimes it leads to clearer inner boundaries. And sometimes it leads to the recognition that love alone is not always enough to sustain emotional intimacy for someone as sensitive as you. That recognition does not arrive with certainty or clarity. It arrives quietly, as a knowing in your body that you can no longer ignore. And many sensitive people stand in this place for a long time, not moving forward, not turning back, but learning how to stay present with complexity, holding love and loneliness at the same time, without betraying themselves or the relationship. This is not indecision, it is integration. And maybe this is where this reflection wants to gently come to rest, not with answers or conclusions, but with a little more honesty and space inside yourself. Because if there is one thing that truly matters in this phase, it is not forcing clarity, not rushing toward decisions, and not turning this loneliness into a problem that needs to be fixed as quickly as possible. What matters is that you stop turning it against yourself. Feeling lonely in a loving relationship does not mean you are failing at love. It does not mean you chose wrong. And it does not mean that something is broken in you. Very often, it simply means that you are becoming more aware of what you need in order to feel emotionally alive and present, and that awareness can feel lonely before it feels empowering. This phase is not asking you to choose between yourself and the relationship. It is asking you to notice where you are present and where you are disappearing, where you feel open and where you quietly close, and whether you are still able to stay connected to yourself while staying connected to the other. That kind of noticing is subtle, and it takes time, because it asks you to slow down rather than react. For some people, this awareness eventually opens the door to deeper emotional conversations that are less about solving something and more about being honest about inner experience. For others, it leads to clearer inner boundaries, to saying less but meaning it more, to no longer automatically adapting when something inside feels off. And for some, over time, it leads to the realization that a relationship can be loving and still not be the right emotional home for the person they are becoming. None of these paths are failures. They are different expressions of self-respect. What matters most is that you allow your loneliness to be meaningful, not as a verdict on your relationship, but as a message from your inner life that wants to be taken seriously. A message that says you want to be real, that you want to be met, and that you no longer want to disappear quietly in order to keep things comfortable. If you are here, listening to this, feeling lonely in a relationship that looks loving from the outside, I want you to know that you are not alone in this experience. Many sensitive people reach this place quietly, without language, without validation, and often without anyone around them really understanding what they are going through. This channel exists for moments like that, for reflection, for depth, and for learning how to stay connected to yourself without hardening or closing. If this video resonated with you, you are very welcome to subscribe to the channel for more reflections on sensitivity, emotional depth, and inner growth. And if you feel like sharing in the comments, you might gently ask yourself this question and put it into words. Have you ever felt lonelier inside a relationship than outside of it? And what did that loneliness begin to show you about yourself? Thank you for being here.